This video is now in session, and the gubernatorial election, since the last time we talked about it, has changed some amount. So in this video, we're going to go over almost every single competitive gubernatorial election happening this cycle. So we're only going to talk about the 50 states. We're excluding the territories for now. But in terms of the 50 states, for the safe seats, there are several safe seats that we can already say will most likely be either Republican or Democratic. These states right here, all of them will likely be almost definitely going to the Republican side, including Vermont, New Hampshire, and as well as Massachusetts. Meanwhile, for the Democratic side, we'd say that New York, Rhode Island, and then Hawaii, and then finally Illinois and New Jersey would go for Democrats by a safe margin. So you can see already Republicans start out with an 8 margin lead against the 10 Democratic gubernatorialships, and that's partly fueled by New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. We've explained this in previous videos, but all three of these governors are pretty liberal Republicans, and they're all very popular in their states. All three of these states are pretty Democratic. New Hampshire is a swing state, but it voted for Biden by 7 percentage points, even though it voted for Sununu, the New Hampshire governor, by 30% against Dan Feltz. So you can see here that Chris Sununu, even though he was governing, even though he was having a re-election during a Biden wave in New Hampshire, he was still able to win by very large margins. In 2018, this was a blue wave year, but Chris Sununu won, and it's partly because Chris Sununu is inheriting a long political dynasty in New Hampshire with the Sununu family, but it's also partly his COVID handling of New Hampshire that has led to a lot of people voting for him. A lot of Democrats switching their votes from Democratic to Republican just for Sununu. So that's why you see the three Republican states here. Charlie Baker, also very popular. He's the governor of Massachusetts, and then finally for the Vermont side, you also have Phil Scott, who is also a liberal Republican. He was a proposed candidate to go against Patrick Leahy, the incumbent senator in Vermont. He is a Democrat, and he has not yet decided whether he wants to run for re-election in 2022 for the U.S. Senate in Vermont. But if he doesn't, then Phil Scott could possibly try to run for that Senate seat in 2022. Unlikely because he already declined, but you never know for sure until the regulatory filings deadlines come through. So those are the safe states by both Republicans and Democrats. And now we move over to the likely state. On the Republican side, we have Iowa, Ohio, South Carolina, and as well as Texas. All four of these states voted by likely margins in the 2020 election, and we can expect the same thing to happen again in the 2022 election. In Texas, Greg Abbott, even though he's very controversial among Texans, still has a large backing of Texas Republicans to help support him in 2022. Governor McMaster in South Carolina, he also is in a pretty Republican state, so he should be fine. But Joe Cunningham is the factor to watch in this state. Joe Cunningham is trying to mount a campaign similar to that of Stacey Abrams in Georgia from 2018, which is get out the vote of Black Americans and then do the most that is possible to get the smallest margin possible. So it's basically building on what happened in the 2020 South Carolina Senate race, when Lindsey Graham was challenged by the Democrats by very heavy margins, very heavy donor margins, and they were able to get a little bit of a vote they were able to dilute the vote margin a little bit, but Joe Cunningham is basically wanting to expand on that. So we'll have to see if that keeps going on. It's unlikely that he'll be able to do much in South Carolina because it's too early at this point for Democrats, based on demographics in South Carolina, to start moving in on the state. But Joe Cunningham could certainly prove that wrong. And then we have Mike DeWine. The main challenge for Mike DeWine is not going to be the general election because he is pretty popular with moderate voters based on his moderate policies. But it's mainly the Republican primary where he will have the most challenge. And the reason why is because Mike DeWine is a moderate and Mike DeWine is a pragmatist, which in the 2020 election and in the COVID pandemic, Mike DeWine defied a lot of what Trump wanted in Ohio, and as a result, Trump got incredibly angry at Mike DeWine, and so does his Republican constituents in Ohio. So that's why you see in the polls that Jim Venacci has a more than 10-point lead, a more than 15-point lead in this poll. So you can see that Mike DeWine's main challenge is the Republican primary, and not the general election. Because for Democrats, if they want to win in Ohio, they will need to take some time to strengthen their voter registration, and they don't have enough time between now and 2022 for that to happen. So those are the likely states for the Republican side. And then for the Democratic side, we have a bunch of likely Democratic states. Oregon is one, New Mexico, Colorado, Minnesota, and then you also have Virginia, Connecticut, Maine, and as well as California is actually not likely. In this scenario, we're basing California off the 2021 recall election and not the 2022 gubernatorial election, simply because there is not enough information for the 2022 election to base off to make any conclusions about it or make any forecasting about it. So we'll talk more about California later, but for these likely states, a lot of them voted likely for the 2020 election. New Mexico, Minnesota, and as well as Virginia, they all voted likely, and so did Maine vote likely for Joe Biden in 2020. But you see additional states that voted for Joe Biden by safe margins, but are expected to vote for Democratic governors by likely margins. In Connecticut, for example, you had a pretty competitive race in 2018, and the reason why is this extends to pretty much most of the New England states. And any state in New England, usually presidentially speaking, a lot of them have moved to the Democratic Party. They used to be a Republican stronghold back when Republicans were committed to cities, to citywide politics. So there is still that Republican New England DNA tied into Connecticut, as well as the other states of Massachusetts and Vermont and New Hampshire. And then if we look at the 2018 election, we saw that Ned Lamont, the incumbent governor, won by very small margins, not even a majority of the vote, only a plurality of the vote, and won by only just 3.2 percentage points. So that's a very low margin for a Democrat in Connecticut, but it makes sense because Democrats and Republicans have, at this point, voted Democratic for presidential elections, but less Democratic in gubernatorial elections. And that is, it sounds weird, but at the same time, it's not weird because gubernatorial politics, state politics, is much more different from national politics. You can vote for a Democrat in national politics, but you may find that a liberal Republican may suit your needs better for state politics than liberal Democrat. So that's the main difference between national and state politics, and that's why people may vote for a Democrat for a governorship and a Republican president, or a Democratic president and a Republican governorship. We see this in Maryland, in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and we'll see that in Kansas. We also saw that in Kentucky and Louisiana in the 2019 election. So those are all the likely states. states. Oh, we also have to talk about Oregon, because Oregon is also another state. In this state, Democrats are just less likely to vote in higher numbers for midterm elections in Oregon, which is why the Republicans have been able to do better than expected in these races. Come 2022, Kate Brown will not be the incumbent governor because she has a term limit. But in terms of the Democratic Party primary, there's already a candidate up on the board, and then Nicholas Kristof could potentially run for this race. If he does run for this race, it's likely that he would be able to win the Democratic primary, and it wouldn't be too hard to say that he would be able to easily win in the 2022 election just because of his credentials. So we're going to keep it as likely just based off of the 2018 election, which was a blue wave year, but Oregon still voted for a Democratic governor by only likely margins. So now we move over to the lean states, and we have 11 competitive states for 2021 and 2022. So let's start off with the Republican side. For Republicans, Alaska is lean, and then Georgia, Florida is lean, and then that's pretty much it. Yeah, it's 3 states. Alaska, actually, wait, no, Alaska should not be lean. It should be likely. Alaska has been moving more Democratic, and if you have not subscribed to our channel, you'll see at our channel's front page, we have a video about how Alaska would turn competitive in 2028, and that's a trend that's mainly happening because of Anchorage. But in the 2022 election, it's still too early for the Democrats to start focusing on trying to get they can focus on getting out the vote in Alaska, but it's too early for them to start thinking that they can win in Alaska politics, just because the demographics of Anchorage have not moved too fast. They have not moved fast enough for them to have a broad influence in the 2022 election. Maybe in the 2026 election and the 2028 election, but 2022 too early. So that's Alaska's likely rating, and then Georgia and Florida. Georgia and Florida, both of them are lean, because both of them. In terms of national politics, they're competitive states, but in terms of gubernatorial politics, we see many times where gubernatorial politics usually is 2 steps behind a national politics. So if, like, for example, in Georgia we have there's Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff as Democratic senators of Georgia. But in terms of the governor's race, it's usually 2 steps behind. So it's still going to be relatively Republican, just because governorships happen during the midterms, and midterm elections usually benefit Republicans more than they do Democrats. Not all the time, like 2018, for the most part, it benefited Democrats, but on average, it benefits Republicans more than the Democratic Party, because Democrats are much more low propensity voters when it comes to midterm elections. So in 2022, it's mainly a get out the vote campaign for the Democratic Party in Georgia. It'll most likely be Stacey Abrams as the Democratic candidate for the 2022 election. And then in terms of the Republican side, this is the real trump card right here. Whether Brian Kemp will be able to win, or someone like Vernon Jones, a challenger to Brian Kemp, if they would be able to get, or if they would ultimately be able to get the upper hand. So what we're seeing here in this race is Brian Kemp is under fire for not subverting lies, for not promulgating lies in the 2020 election, in the aftermath of the election, where Georgia went to Joe Biden by tilt margins. A lot of Republicans were angry that Brian Kemp would not challenge the vote count and would not challenge the results of the election, which in some ways is ridiculous, but that's we've covered that on many times. So Because of that, Brian Kemp is in a vulnerable position. So far, these polls show that Brian Kemp is leading, but there is the Trump card, quite literally speaking, because if Trump does endorse another candidate, if Trump endorses Vernon Jones or Doug Collins, then if Trump endorses either of them and Vernon Jones continues to run, or Doug Collins decides to run, then not Doug Collins, I mean David Perdue. I meant David Perdue. But if either David Perdue or Vernon Jones gets the Trump endorsement and David Perdue or Vernon Jones continue to run, then Brian Kemp will almost certainly be done. We can see here in this Trafalgar Group polling that Doug Collins, in the event that oh wait, this is not the right polling, but Fabrizio did do another polling that's not really shown here for some reason, but they did a polling that asked whether or not, if David Perdue was endorsed by Trump, would you vote for David Perdue over Brian Kemp? And there was a wide margin between Brian Kemp and David Perdue, where many Republicans went in favor of Perdue, who lost in the 2020 election to John Ossoff. He said David Perdue has not said whether he would run or not. He declined to run in the 2022 Georgia Senate race, where Raphael Warnock is up for re-election. So David Perdue could certainly run. He could certainly also not run. Meanwhile, in the Democratic Party, most likely Stacey Abrams will end up on top. So we have the election set, and you can see here that out of these candidates, for the most part, Stacey Abrams gets close to winning, but not quite there. She could certainly tip the balance by getting more voters registered for the 2022 election, like she did in the 2020 election. But for now, we would rate Georgia as lean. And then we also have Florida. This race, Ron DeSantis is up for re-election, and it's going to be somewhat competitive because Democrats recognize that Ron DeSantis will probably want to run for president in 2024, and they recognize that if Ron DeSantis does not win the governorship of Florida in 2022, most likely he would not be able to run for president in 2024. So, Florida, right now, it's at a competitive state because of COVID cases, but we would say that as COVID cases dwindle down, most likely Floridians would forget that Ron DeSantis has governed over a period where a lot of cases has been garnered among Floridians, just like how many Floridians forgot about Ron DeSantis' handling of the COVID pandemic last summer when COVID cases were at an all-time high in Florida. So with that, we would rate it as lean. Lean is anywhere from 1 to 5%. So we would put it at the stronger end of the lean category, so more towards the 5% end for Ron DeSantis. But it is more competitive than most people think, just because of how Florida is not really a Republican stronghold as of yet. So with that, we'd rate it as lean. And then finally, we have we have the Democratic slate of lean states. So we'll do lean and tilt combined for the Democratic Party. So Pennsylvania is lean, Michigan is lean, Kansas is tilt, and then Maryland is lean. And then you can recognize here that Arizona is tilt. So California is lean just because it's for the 2021 election, just because it's a question of whether or not Democrats will be able to turn out their voters in the September 14th election. If they're not able to do that, then most likely a Republican would be able to get the California executive mansion. But as of now, we're seeing that Democrats are starting to pay more attention to this race, even though a lot of Democrats just don't want to pay attention to this race. A lot of them recognize that they still have to vote in this election in order to keep out Republican challengers, which is why we would rate it as lean. But in terms of the Get Out the Vote campaign in California, At this point, Democrats are again low propensity voters when it comes to off-year elections and midterm elections, which makes it very hard for someone like Gavin Newsom to win by very large margins. So at this point, we're keeping the seat at a lean margin. And then we also have Nevada. Nevada, pretty inelastic. It's kind of like North Carolina, except Nevada at this point doesn't have any Republican insurgency to go against the Democrats like Democrats do in North Carolina. So we would rate this seat as lean. And then Kansas. Kansas is interesting because Laura Kelly, the incumbent governor of Kansas, is at a very vulnerable position, but incumbency will definitely help her, just like how it did with John Bel Edwards in the 2019 election. Incumbency matters in these elections, and if most Kansas individuals see Laura Kelly as not a threat to Kansas, then they'll most likely continue to vote for her come 2022, because again, state politics is different from national politics. National politics, usually it's about whichever one has the more better rhetoric, but for state elections, it's usually about whoever has the policies that impact the most for them, who best suit the needs of Kansas. And many times, a lot of individuals simply want a split between the president and the governor in political parties, which is why a lot of Republicans vote for Democratic governors and vice versa. So we can see that situation happening here again. But Kansas, do keep in mind, is a very Republican state. But at the same time, Louisiana is also a very Republican state. Kentucky is also a very Republican state, which can make this race still favorable to Laura Kelly. So we would rate it as tilt. And then Wisconsin, Tony Evers will likely win by tilt margins because Wisconsin is competitive, but at the same time, Tony Evers has brought moderate politics and has shown to resonate with a lot of Wisconsinonians, I guess, in the Milwaukee region and as well as in the Madison region. So if he's able to get both areas of Wisconsin, he will be pretty set out for 2022. For Michigan and Pennsylvania, both of those states voted for Joe Biden by lean margins, and we can expect the same thing to happen here. Gretchen Whitmer still has the support of the Democratic strongholds of Wayne County, and as well as the smaller towns like Ann Arbor and as well as Kalamazoo. So we expect lean margins there. In Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf is not able to run for re-election in Pennsylvania, which makes this seat much more competitive than normally speaking, because in 2014 and 2018, Tom Wolf won by pretty large margins. But come 2022, it's expected to be a lot more competitive. Most likely, the Democrats will nominate Josh Shapiro, the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, to become Pennsylvania's next governor. And then meanwhile, on the Republican side, we have there are a bunch of Republicans that are trying to run to succeed Tom Wolf. So for this race, Josh Shapiro is relatively popular with Pennsylvanians. He is also able to bring an inspiration campaign that a lot of other people can't bring to these kinds of campaigns. His credentials during the 2020 election also puts him at a much better state to be able to win in this election, where he took a more pragmatic approach to explaining the 2020 election results. And then we finally have Maryland for the Democratic side. Maryland, this seat is currently held by Republican Larry Hogan. Larry Hogan is term limited. He is not allowed to run another term. So as a result, Republicans are most likely going to get this seat flipped from Republican to Democrat, just because Larry Hogan was elected back in 2014 during a Republican wave year. This year, 2022, it is expected to go towards the Republicans in overall, but not by as large of a margins as in 2014. And plus, Maryland has gotten a lot more Democratic than it used to be. So with that, it has strengthened its Democratic stronghold, and as a result, we can expect this seat to at least go for lean for the Democratic Party. That's the Democratic side, and then we have one more seat in Arizona. This seat is currently held by Doug Ducey, who is the incumbent governor, but is also also term limited. He is not allowed to run another term. And with that, you have a bunch of candidates on both the Republican and Democratic sides to try to get this seat. But like we said before, usually governors' elections are 2 steps behind. Usually, governor elections are 2 steps behind national elections. So even though Joe Biden was able to win in the 2020 election for Arizona, likely speaking, a lot of Arizona voters will still vote for Republicans in 2022 just because Donald Trump kind of quickened the pace of Arizona going towards the Democrats. Arizona had someone like Mitt Romney run for president in 2020. He would most likely win in Arizona, and Arizona would not as quickly shift to the Democratic Party as it did under Trump. But we can expect a shift back to the Republican Party, somewhat similar to North Carolina in 2008 and 2012 and 2010. But it will be a competitive seat and a competitive race, and eventually Arizona will entirely go for the Democratic Party because of demographics. But for now, we expect Republicans to just be able to squeak out in this race. But obviously, these ratings are only effective as of August 21st, 2021. After August 21st, or between now and the election day, a lot can happen. So we're most likely going to see some changes to this race. Like New York, for example, it went from lean to safe because Andrew Cuomo, the incumbent governor of New York, resigned. So with that, a lot of changes can happen, and this forecast is almost definitely not final. But until the next forecast, thank you for watching this video. This video is now adjourned, and we'll see you in the next one.